Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you all back to the ballroom for our plenary panel. Our plenary panel today is on the topic of war crimes, causes, excuses, and blame. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I will also be serving as moderator for this panel discussion. And once again, you notice the word discussion. This is again meant to be very interactive, slightly different format than some of you might be used to. Each of our presenters will attempt valiantly to speak for only about 10 minutes to give us a sense of their much more extensive research. And then we will have a moderated discussion with the panelists themselves briefly, and then I will open the floor to all of you. So if you will be preparing your questions, and as during the keynote a few minutes ago, when it is a moment for you to speak, if you could get the microphone so we can all hear you. This room absorbs a certain amount of sound. So to introduce you to our panelists, we have first to my right here, Professor Mitt Regan. And Mitt is the DeWitt Professor of Jurisprudence, Director of the Center on the Legal Profession, and co-director on the Center for National Security and Law at Georgetown University Law Center. His work focuses on international law, national security, international human rights, and legal and military ethics. Professor Regan is also Senior Fellow at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, and an adjunct faculty member at the Center for Military and Security Law at the Australian National University College of Law. Welcome, Mitt. Our second presenter this morning is Jessica Wolfendale. She is the author of Torture and the Military Profession, co-editor of New Wars and New Soldiers, Military Ethics in the Contemporary World, and has published numerous articles and book chapters on topics ranging from security, torture, terrorism, bioethics, and of course, broad range of military ethics. And her work has appeared in many prestigious journals, and her most recent book, War Crimes, Causes and Excuses and Blame, is obviously related to our discussion today and is currently in production with Oxford University Press. Welcome. And last but not least, Matt Talbert is an associate professor of philosophy and chair of the Department of Philosophy at West Virginia University. He is the author of a number of papers on moral psychology and moral responsibility, and the author of Moral Responsibility and Introduction from 2016. Welcome. Now we're going to launch off at the far end of the panel. If you'd like to take it away.
Okay, well, I'm really excited to be here. What I'm going to be talking about today is a summary of the first part of the book I've co-written with Matthew Talbot called War Crimes, Causes, Excuses and Blame, which is in press with Oxford University Press. We hope to have some advertising material, but it's not quite far enough in the production process. But I have been told that we can circulate the book's introduction to anybody who's interested. So if you are interested, please feel free to let me know. So I'm going to talk about the first half of the book in 10 minutes, which is going to be interesting. And my co-author will talk about the second half of the book in his presentation. I'm going to start my timer. Okay, so very broadly speaking, the outline of the talk is as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about situationist accounts of war crimes and problems with these accounts. I won't spend too much time on that. I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk talking about the account that we propose in our book about the causes of war crimes. I'll talk about war crimes and moral legitimization and the causes of war crimes before concluding with some implications of our view for prevention of war crimes. So I'll just introduce you to this, what we're calling the situationist view. Basically, this is a view of war crimes that proposes that war crimes result from the effect of situational forces on military personnel. And this is often supported by research in social psychology, such as, for example, the Milgram experiments you might be familiar with, or often cited as evidence in support of this view. But the basic idea is that you both have heat of battle situational forces, so in combat situational stresses, such as fatigue and stress and fear, that can lead military personnel to commit war crimes, but you also have longer-term, more diffuse situational forces such as propaganda, training in obedience, dehumanisation of the enemy, effects of group bonding, that also might lead to the commission of war crimes. So this view is defended, for example, by John Doris and Dominic Murphy in a 2007 paper about Abu Ghraib. And the result of these situational forces, both kinds, heat of battle and diffuse situational forces, is that soldiers' normative competence is undermined. So normative competence refers to their ability to understand and recognise and act on moral reasons in the face of opposing forces. So military personnel may come to believe that war crimes are permissible as a result of these diffuse situational forces. Okay, so there's a number of problems we think occur with this view. I'll talk about the first one most. We think this is the most serious objection to the situationist account. The problem is that, look, perpetrators who are exposed to the same kinds of situational forces still bring very different attitudes to their own behaviour. So some perpetrators engage in war crimes almost with enthusiasm, with a smile, hence the smile problem, where other perpetrators seem to display reluctance or very different kinds of attitudes to what they do. And it's difficult for the situationist account to explain those individual behavioural differences, given that these are perpetrators who have been exposed to the same kinds of external situational forces. So we see there's a very significant problem with this view, and fundamentally the view ignores the role played by an individual's beliefs, goals, values in understanding her actions and how they come about. So if you're interested in the other two problems, I can talk about that in question time. So I'll move now to our account of war crimes that we develop in the book. So our account of war crimes starts from the recognition that many war crimes result from a process of moral legitimisation. So many perpetrators of war crimes, and this is particularly true of large-scale institutionalised war crimes like programs of torture or genocidal programs, many perpetrators believe themselves actually to be acting in accordance with moral principles and moral virtues, rather than acting against them. And so we can't assume from the get-go that perpetrators have had to sort of overcome moral doubts and moral inhibition. So as Harold Welzer puts it, we can't assume they've had to overcome prior morally motivated inhibitions in order to commit war crimes. So we're interested in what we explore in the book is how does this process of moral legitimisation come about? So in our account, there are, broadly speaking, two levels that are related to the causes of war crimes and that contribute to this process of moral legitimisation. So I'll talk about both levels in more details in a moment. The first level is the level of culture, and I'm using the word culture very broadly here. So the basic idea here is that moral concepts such as justice, respect, or honour, or even duty don't have an objectively understood, accepted meaning. Right, that those abstract principles are filtered through available social articulations and social narratives and given a particularly socially relevant interpretation that then affects how individuals within that society apply and understand that principle. And it affects what Herlinda Power-Stewart and David Velleman call habits of moral perception. So even what we see as being morally relevant in a situation is affected by the socially available narratives that shape our moral thinking. At the level of the individual, we argue that these social understandings of morality and moral principles are then interpreted by individuals in light of their own unique beliefs, goals, and self-conceptions and goals. So really you need to understand both levels in order to understand how perpetrators come to be involved in large-scale war crimes. So as an example of the social articulation of morality at the level of culture, in the book we talk a little bit about Alexander Hinton's discussion of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And what's fascinating about the Khmer Rouge is how they used pre-existing cultural and religious concepts in order to justify torture, killing and the genocidal program, in order for the program to make sense to the people who were involved in it. So, for example, they reframed some familiar Buddhist concepts such as mindfulness to mean, for the mindfulness came to mean, for example, focusing yourself on your revolutionary consciousness. That was how mindfulness was interpreted by the Khmer Rouge. Detachment was interpreted to mean detachment from families and friends, which enabled you more easily to turn them over to the authorities if they displayed anti-revolutionary traits. Self-control and discipline were interpreted as virtues for torturers and people involved in executions. And this is a quote from the Khmer Rouge's manual for torture, which said, "Torture is not something we do out of individual anger. The good torturer is someone who exhibits these virtues, and they were characterised as virtues. So this kind of use of familiar and culturally resonant principles and concepts enabled perpetrators to make sense of their actions within this pre-existing framework. So I'll turn now to the role of the individual. In the book, we draw on a social psychology theory of personality known as CAPS theory, Cognitive Affective Personality System, first developed by social psychologist Walter Mischel in the 1960s. And very succinctly, clearly I'm not going to be able to do justice to it right now, but the basic idea here is that, personality is not just something which exists independently of situations, but nor is it something which is in conflict with situations. So in contrast to the situationist view of human behaviour, it's not the person versus the situation and the situation wins out in determining what someone does. Rather, to even understand what a situation is, you have to understand how an individual makes sense of the situation. What does the situation mean to her in light of her self-conceptions, beliefs, goals and values? So the principle of construal is very central to this theory. Meaning of a situation depends on the individual's construal, how she makes sense of it. And so understanding an individual's actions requires understanding how her actions make sense to her and understanding how she interprets the situation. So behaviour is the result of a sort of constant interaction between situations and the goals, values, self-conceptions individuals bring to situations. And it's a constantly sort of back and forth between the two. And it means that we can't really describe situations just by pointing to objective features in situations. We have to understand how agents construe them. So to illustrate the intersection between the sort of cultural and individual level in terms of making sense of war crimes, we talk about two case studies in the book. So these are case studies discussed by Power, Studer and Velleman in their article, and both Felix Landau and Karl Kretschmer were members of Einsatzgruppen units in World War II who participated in mass shootings of Jewish civilians. And both of them left testimony in the form of diaries and letters from the time, so very valuable testimony into their thought processes at the time they were involved in these war crimes. So Felix Landau, for example, was very much focused on being a good worker. He didn't enjoy killing civilians. His objection, though, was not really based on any deep moral objection, more that he felt that it wasn't really what being a soldier was supposed to be. So he says in his diary that he would far rather good, honest, open combat, but, he's been told to kill civilians, so he'll kill civilians because that's what his duty is. But he's very critical of enthusiastic shooters. So he writes that he doesn't, he's objects to people who take pleasure in the act of killing. In contrast, Karl Kretschmer very much believed in the idea that the genocide was necessary to protect the German people from an existential threat. So Karl Kretschmer, and here he wrote a lot of letters to his family during his experiences, he said that my comrades are literally fighting for the existence of our people. And he expressed a lot of doubt and distress at participating in the killings, unlike Felix Landau. But for him, his doubt and distress was evidence of his personal weakness, him not being able to step up to the plate to defend the people. So he wrote to his daughter, and this is such an extraordinary quote, to his young daughter, "It is a weakness not to be able to stand the sight of dead people. The best way to overcome it is to do it more often," i.e. to kill more often or see dead people more often. So I think what we see here is two perpetrators who are exposed to very similar situational forces, both in training and in the field, as it were, but who bring very different interpretations to their understanding their own role in what they're doing, and interpretations that shape their behaviour in different ways. So Karl Kretschmer, because he was very much focused on being a good professional soldier, he wouldn't seek out the killings, he wouldn't, he would discourage overly enthusiastic killings. Whereas, that was Felix Landau, excuse me. Karl Kretschmer, in contrast, really felt he ought to engage in the killings more enthusiastically to better enable protecting the people against the threat posed by the Jews. And so we see again adoption of sort of available narratives in different ways. Karl Kretschmer very much adopted the available narrative that interpreted the genocide as a war and as an existential threat. For him, that's the framework he adopted and then adapted it according to his own personal framework. Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about the implications of our view. So what our view suggests is that to understand war crimes, we have to understand war crimes as an interaction between perpetrators' goals, values, beliefs, and self-conception. So again, think about Felix Landau's self-conception as being a good worker. That was very important to his own personal view of himself. But also the interaction between these and available social articulations of morality. So how are, for example, how is a war being construed in the context of a particular conflict? So, describing the genocide against the Jews as a war was a particular narrative that had implications for understanding concepts such as duty and honour given in the light of that narrative. So you need both aspects to understand the causes of war crimes. And what this means is that we shouldn't really think about war crimes so much as failures of individual self-control in the face of overwhelming situational forces, right? So that's another picture of war crimes. War crimes occur because individual soldiers are unable to act on their moral virtues in the face of various situational forces. We think that picture is largely mistaken, at least in relation to large-scale institutionalised war crimes. So focusing on enhancing individual moral character, the problem with that approach, in our view, is that it ignores the role of these broader social and moral frameworks in legitimising war crimes. So to conclude, the suggestions for preventing war crimes that we think come out of our account, and these are just suggestions at this point, we haven't developed this in much detail, is that it's very important to educate military personnel about the causes of war crimes, and specifically to emphasise that the good guys can commit war crimes, that dangerous articulations of morality, dangerous social and political narratives that distort particular kinds of moral principles can actually become dominant narratives, and you may not realise it when you're living in amongst it. So one possible prevention strategy is, rather than focusing again on just sort of individual virtues, but is allowing dissenting narratives to flourish, or at least to exist within closed environments such as the military profession. So I'll leave it there. My co-author is going to turn to the question of moral responsibility for war crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm going to summarize a couple chapters from the book that deal with moral responsibility. I'll set my timer to make sure. So what is moral responsibility? When philosophers talk about moral responsibility, typically the way it gets defined is in terms of openness to praise or blame, depending on the moral status of the action in question. Since we're talking about war crimes, I'm going to be talking about blameworthiness. Blameworthiness, often by philosophers, is construed in terms of openness to a certain set of negative reactive attitudes. Most often, we talk about resentment in this context. And resentment is an emotion that responds to the awareness that you've been treated with ill will, with contempt, with lack of appropriate regard. The situationist experimental tradition, we might think that undermines moral responsibility for a number of reasons. The one that we're most interested in is normative competence. Do these situational pressures undermine normative competence? In particular, we're interested in the way that this objection is put forward by John Doris in his important 2002 book, Lack of Character, but also in his co-authored 2007 paper with Dominic Murphy, From My Lie to Abu Ghraib, the moral psychology of atrocity. So Doris in the 2002 book defines normative competence this way. It's the ability to appreciate normative considerations, ascertain information relevant to normative judgments, and to engage in effective deliberation, and to be able to turn that deliberation into morally appropriate action. If you can do that, you got normative competence. If you can't do it, then your normative competence is impaired to some degree. Here's their argument for lack of responsibility on the part of perpetrators of war crimes. They say that perpetrators manifest cognitive impairments. They manifest impaired normative competence. Their capacity to engage in moral judgments has been profoundly degraded. They think that's often the case, and it's going to follow that perpetrators of atrocity typically occupy excusing conditions. They're excused for their behavior, therefore they're not blameworthy, they're not morally responsible because their normative competence has been undermined. The ultimate conclusion from the 2007 paper is that there ought to be a strong general presumption that perpetrators of atrocities are not morally responsible. Now, how broadly does this apply? On the one hand, there are combat pressures. So they say that the combat environment is cognitively degraded. It's hard to figure out what's going on. There are all kinds of stressors that make it difficult for military personnel to be aware of what they're doing at all. How can we expect them to conduct themselves in a morally appropriate fashion in that context? Now, we're willing to grant that significant stressors do undermine moral responsibility and do constitute excusing conditions. But Doris and Murphy want the non-responsibility conclusion to apply much more broadly. They think that military training and culture itself constitutes a normative competence undermining force. Military training reconfigures the range of behavioral options for military personnel, they believe. So personnel might come into the military with beliefs about what's permissible, what's impermissible in military training, being exposed, for instance, to propaganda, indoctrination, peer group effects, can alter military personnel's sense of what's appropriate, can lead them to believe that morally inappropriate behavior is in fact permissible, maybe even required by morality. And Jessica was alluding to some of the ways in which this might work. So here's the excuse argument summarized. Military training undermines normative competence. It's often unreasonable to expect personnel to recognize the wrongfulness of their behavior, but it's fair to blame a wrongdoer only if it was reasonable to expect her to recognize the wrongfulness of her behavior. Therefore, military personnel are often not open to moral blame. Now, you might reject some of the premises here. You might think that military training doesn't universally undermine normative competence. And Doris and Murphy do want to make that strong claim that almost always military personnel are excused from blame because almost always they've been exposed to situational pressures that you can't expect them to withstand and that have altered their perception of what's permissible. But even if you reject that large claim, you might think that sometimes soldiers, military personnel, have been exposed to these pressures, indoctrination, propaganda, that we can't expect them to withstand. So sometimes they reasonably, in a subjective sense, they reasonably believe that their impermissible behavior is permissible, and then you might conclude that at least for that subset of military personnel, it's not appropriate to blame them. We want to reject that conclusion. We think that moral blameworthiness applies very broadly in the context of war crimes, especially if we're thinking about atrocities that occur outside of combat environments. Combat environments might constitute excusing conditions, but the forces of military education and acculturation don't necessarily do that. But we're willing to grant, and again, a lot of people in this room might not want to grant this, but we're willing to grant that it may often be unreasonable to expect perpetrators to recognize the moral status of their behavior. We're granting that for the sake of argument. That's an important premise in Doris and Murphy's argument, so we're going to give them that. We're also going to allow that it's not that particular military personnel, not his fault that he lacks the capacity in question. So it may be that it's not reasonable to expect him to recognize that his behavior is wrong, and it might be, we will grant, not his fault that he's in that condition. He lacked control over the factors that led him to form this belief about the permissibility of his behavior. Our response is that this is largely irrelevant to moral blameworthiness, that even a perpetrator who believes that he's behaving permissibly, his actions can have moral significance that makes blaming attitudes appropriate. We try to motivate that conclusion in lots of different ways. One of the things we do is to focus on how excuses work. Excusing conditions are standardly contexts like coercion, unconsciousness, ignorance. So we've been talking about military personnel who have false beliefs about the permissibility of their behavior. Those individuals suffer from a form of ignorance, and you might draw the conclusion that since I just said that ignorance often does excuse, that perhaps this particular form of moral ignorance excuses. And that's the inference that we're going to try to undercut. There are different forms of ignorance. There's circumstantial ignorance. There's moral ignorance. The individual in question who believes, let's say, that torture is permissible suffers from moral ignorance. The question is whether or not that's the kind of ignorance that excuses. The example that we use in the book is you might have an acquaintance, suppose you have an acquaintance who serves you poisoned food. Now this friend of yours has harmed you, but is she blameworthy? Well, she's going to be blameworthy only if she knew what she was doing. Or perhaps she should have known what she was doing. But if you believe that she didn't know, and she had no reason to know that she was harming you, then you're going, and you should, regard her as excused. Why? Because her behavior does not express contempt for you. She's not showing you lack of appropriate regard, even though she did something that harmed you. But the military torturer who believes that torture is permissible, that's quite compatible with him showing you lack of regard, with him believing that it's permissible his belief that it's permissible to treat you this way implies that he takes you to lack the moral standing that would make his behavior impermissible. If we agree with the victim in that context, if we agree that the victim has moral standing that makes that treatment impermissible, then we ought to think that it's appropriate for the victim to communicate her belief about her own moral standing through reactive attitudes such as resentment. But that's just to say that the torturer, even though he doesn't view himself as an appropriate target of resentment, he is, in our view and in the victim's view, an apt target for that emotional response, which is just to say that he is open to blame, that is, he's blameworthy. He has expressed through his behavior a commitment to this individual's lack of standing. And that individual has, on our view, the right to respond to that with her own commitment to her moral standing. So the last point I'll make is that a lot of people take this to be a very hardline view. They want to say, well, look, you're talking about a soldier, for example, who's been exposed to these forces that he had no control over. He might have been a conscript. He might have been exposed to very intense efforts to remold his conception of what's appropriate. He himself is a victim. He has been injured by being turned into a person who now believes that the most atrocious behavior is morally permissible. It's not any part of our project to deny that those people have been victimized. But what we want to emphasize is that there's a real cost to calling into question that person's blameworthiness. So in this context, we discuss the rape used as a weapon of war, particularly in the context of the Bosnian War. There might have been Serbian soldiers who believed that this was a permissible tool in their military, political, and ethnic struggle. But the fact that they believed that it was permissible to treat certain women in this way doesn't give the woman a reason to call off her own resentment and to tell her that that's what she ought to do, that her blaming attitudes are not apt, asks her to misconstrue the moral situation as she sees it and as we see it. I presume that we agree that she has been treated impermissibly, that her moral standing has been called into question, so we ought to view it as her prerogative to express her own commitment about her moral standing, and that's going to happen through blaming emotions. But that's just to say that those emotional responses are apt, but that's just to say that the wrongdoer is an appropriate target for blame, i.e. he's blameworthy. Thank you.
Well, the great benefit of agreeing to be a commentator on this panel is that I got a chance to read the manuscript of the book. And it's terrific. It's really rich. It's multi-layered. I highly recommend it when it comes out. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of it, obviously. What I want to talk about is the portion of it that reconciles, if you will, the situationist literature that Jess mentioned, Martin mentioned it earlier in his question, with virtue ethics and the notion of some sort of relatively stable disposition or character. So I won't be focusing on primarily what Matt discussed, which is a notion of blame that really draws heavily on sort of Strawson's notion of resentment, for instance, which is also a very rich and I think really valuable part of the book. All right. So this reconciliation or integration of the situationist and the dispositional approaches conceptualizes character as having elements of stability that at the same time are dynamic and that are shaped by social context. This is why the process of moral legitimization or social articulation of values, as they describe it in the book, is so important. And so what I want to do today is talk about these insights and how they may apply to military small unit culture. Now, Erlinda Power-Strader and David Velleman, two scholars on whom Matt and Jess draw in their book, open an important article with this statement. Judging by the mainstream professional journals, one would have to conclude the only impact of the Holocaust on the practice of moral philosophy has been to make it easier. by providing a set of uncontroversial examples. Right? As they say, if the immorality of the Nazis had been as obvious to the perpetrators as it is today, the crimes might never have occurred. The execution of Jews was regarded by the executioners themselves not as a guilty excess, but rather as an onerous duty. And Matt and Jess's book provides valuable elaboration on this point. Abstract principles have to be socially articulated in concrete settings to provide meaningful guides to behavior. The world doesn't come at us labeled with respect to what is and is not morally significant. Experience has to be invested with meaning in order for individuals to have a sense of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what moral status it has. Kantian scholar Barbara Herrmann describes this as the generation of rules of moral salience. She says, these structure an agent's perception of his situation so that what he perceives is a world with moral features. They enable him to pick out those elements of his circumstances or proposed actions that require moral attention. These rules of moral salience identify what constitutes a harm or injury, what counts as fairness, which needs should be met and by whom, what it means to respect and disrespect others, and what it is that individuals owe one another, all in the context of particular settings. As Herrmann says, generating such rules is a practical task for a community of moral agents. Indeed, it serves to define a moral community. Now, the military, of course, is an institution that serves as a powerful source of the social articulation of values and of rules of moral salience, right? As such, it constitutes itself as a moral community by that process of generating those rules as a profession, right? It's especially influential because it resembles what Irving Goffman calls a total institution, which regulates a substantial part of one's behavior, more than many, probably most other professions, right? But the point I want to make is we should not see the military as monolithic, nor as establishing rules for moral salience that are uniformly understood, received, and applied. Military culture in general provides one filter of moral salience, but the rules have to be translated at various levels by people in the specific settings in which they work. There are layers upon layers of social articulation, as rules of moral salience are necessarily filtered and applied in terms of the characteristic forms of experience that people encounter in their daily lives. There will be, for instance, distinctive experiences in different branches of the services, among people within a service performing different functions, at different levels of activity, from strategic to operational to tactical. Now, with respect to war crimes, the most significant level of articulation is the combat unit, right? This is the proverbial tip of the spear at which the values guiding the use of violence are most immediately relevant and directly applied, which is why, of course, there is ethics training, right, for those who will be engaging in conflict. But as an officer in one study commented, I don't think our efforts here at the training command have made much of a difference. Oh, we shined them up like new money and sent them off to the teams. But when they got to the operational platoons, they immediately adapted to the culture of their platoon. Right? Dick Couch, who has worked extensively with special operations personnel, says during mortal combat, a warrior's conduct depends on small unit ethos and the influence of the fellow fighting next to him. The external controls, the rules imposed by society, the conventions of warfare, lose influence with time and distance. As he says, 4 soldiers in a Humvee on patrol near Kandahar share a bond and are more important to each other than anything that may have come down from the colonel or the Constitution or that can be imposed by any set of rules. Small units thus constitute microcultures, if you will, that can generate subtly different narratives, norms, and expectations. So if we want to influence how values are articulated at the small unit level, we need a good understanding of small unit dynamics, right? And research indicates there are at least three that are particularly important. One dynamic is the potential discrepancy between rank and status. Couch, again, says small unit culture is divided into two distinct classes: those who have been in combat and those who have not. Those who have been in combat are afforded stature, even though they may not necessarily have rank. Those who are perceived to have done well in combat have both stature and influence, and often that influence can surpass seniority and rank. Combat experience can also overshadow issues of character and right and wrong conduct. So that's one dynamic of a small unit culture that's important. A second dynamic is what's called the proximity rule. This holds that what a combat leader tolerates in his or her presence is critical. Letting something pass without criticism or challenge can be tantamount to a stamp of approval. It can set norms by omission rather than commission. Third powerful feature is the pull of unit loyalty. As Couch says, if there's a single factor that allows for wrong conduct in our deployed ground combat units, it's loyalty within those very units. This is what makes a consistently high standard of tactical ethics so difficult to achieve. Now, a powerful example of this is from the incident that is the subject of the book Black Hearts, with which some of you are probably familiar. On March 12, 2006, 5 U.S. soldiers broke into an Iraqi family's home in Mahmadiyah, Iraq. They raped the 14-year-old daughter. They set her on fire. They killed her 6-year-old sister, and they killed her parents. The fire spread from her body to the rest of the house and burned down the house. Sergeant Tony Uribe led a patrol right after that was ordered to investigate the incident. Shortly after the patrol returned, Private Stephen Green told Uribe that he had committed the murders. Green had a reputation as unstable and a loudmouth who hated Iraqis, and Uribe doubted his credibility. Green, however, who had not been on the patrol investigating the incident, described in detail the scene. Uribe told Green to go see combat stress counselors and tell him his feelings about Iraqis with the intention that they would discharge him, which they did. Green returned home. Uribe did not, however, report Green to his superiors. Eventually, he mentioned what Green had told him to another member of his unit, Justin Watt. Watt reported the incident to superiors, although he didn't mention Uribe. After an investigation revealed that Uribe had failed to report the incident, he was separated from service with an other than honorable discharge. Now, there is a fascinating set of transcripts of interviews with many of the people connected with the Black Hearts incident. In them, Uribe is asked why he didn't disclose what Green had told him once an investigation had begun based on Watt's report. Uribe said, "Man, I've asked myself the same thing. If I had told them, I probably would have never been charged with a crime and I wouldn't have been kicked out of the Army." And then he stopped for a few moments and said this: "The truth is, if I was put back in that situation, even knowing what I know now, I still wouldn't turn him in. I know turning him in is the right thing. I know I'd be wrong not to do it, but I wouldn't do it. I just couldn't send to prison the guys who'd saved my life in combat." Right? So these are among the dynamics that shape small unit culture. Officers, NCOs, other members of units all contribute to that culture by contributing to a collective narrative that provides meaning and furnishes coherence. These narratives provide answers to the questions: what is it we're doing here? Why? How should we relate to these people around us? These narratives are enacted in everyday life, on patrols, at checkpoints, in firefights, on convoys. This is the way abstract social values are articulated on the ground. As a Marine junior officer said it, and he expressed this well, A lot of what I do is serve as a translator for what is right and wrong, what is acceptable conduct and what is unacceptable conduct. And that's an excellent description of the process of social articulation of values. Now, none of what I've said, I'm sure, will come as a surprise to those of you with military experience, right? The value of a book like Matt and Jess's, I think, is it can provide a useful analytical framework that complements, enriches what you probably already know. I think it could be especially fruitful for philosophers, psychologists, and others to work with those who have firsthand experience with small units. As some of you know, 2011, the U.S. Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences approached the National Research Council to establish a committee to synthesize and evaluate research opportunities in the behavioral social sciences related to social and organizational factors that influence small unit behavior in military environments. The committee issued a report in 2014 that describes a potential research agenda. So it will be important, I think, to follow that work and, if possible, engage with it. More generally, I just want to say in closing that I think it can be very valuable to begin to move from the level of military ethics in general to how military values are articulated on more local levels that are the settings in which individuals act on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I for one, am also looking forward to not only getting my hands on the book, but assigning it to our students to read. And I would like to do what I had told you in advance we would do first, which is allow the panel to speak to one another briefly. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you one particular question for that conversation. And then I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the floor, so we'll open it out to that. I'm going to direct this initially at you, Jess. So much of this important work has implications, obviously, as you all three noted, for the way that troops are trained. And certainly PME, professional military education, has been under attack lately, and arguably forever, but it's certainly been under attack even more lately. I wonder if you could share more that you weren't able to when you had your presentation time about how they can do what Mitt was calling these translations. You suggested, for example, some work could be done around showing exactly how it does go wrong, to say that they can recognize and see this. I'm very intrigued by that. What other specific strategies can happen for the people in these smaller units to try to make sure that when someone hears duty, they don't interpret it in some of these very pernicious ways?
First of all, thank Mick for his comments, because that was very helpful, is that I think it's important that, I sometimes think that military ethics education focuses on cases where we're talking about war crimes that don't actually come out of this process of moral legitimization, which is a very important class of war crimes to consider. So, for example, the black arts or black ops? Black hearts, I'm sorry. It's probably fair to say that the people involved in that crime didn't believe that what they were doing was required by military virtue or required or viewed as morally good. So, in a sense, we want to understand how it is that individuals on the ground can come to perform acts that they themselves recognise as being morally impermissible. Right? What are the failures that lead to those kinds of war crimes? But I think it's also vitally important to look at these cases which is really more the focus of our book as well, which is that, well, what about the cases where their actions are performed because they think it is required, or they've been told it's required by military necessity or other military virtues? Because there you don't have that pushback. You don't have this idea, well, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I'm excused for reasons, I don't know, combat fatigue or stress or fear or something like that.
And you made the point that they might actually feel that any reluctance they feel is a lack of
weakness.
It's a weakness. It's a lack of commitment.
My dissertation many years ago was on military torture, and I was very interested in how it is that military forces that are committed to human rights can end up carrying out institutionalized torture, right? And one of the things that comes out of that analysis is the number of people and levels involved in making that happen. So, when torture is institutionalized, it becomes a standard operating procedure, then you're involved. You've got all levels. You've got the level of the political authorization, involvement of lawyers, medical professionals, psychologists, as well as individuals on the ground. And so there, understanding how that can come to be seen as not just consistent but even required by military principles is something which I think is a really important addition to military ethics education. But it does mean confronting and accepting that, we can do these things. It can be the case that there are particular narratives that come to be dominant, which lead us to believe that it is that even the good guys can come to believe and carry out these war crimes. So I think that's important. I think there's been a tendency to focus more on how do we prevent these. I can't think of it. Bottom up is not really what I mean, but on the ground war crimes that are not the process of,
right.
And I think MIT's analysis is really valuable there, and that's very important. That is a kind of social articulation of values in a very
very small unit.
Yeah, very small unit, and that can lead to sort of other kinds of war crimes. But I also think it's very, very much important to pay more attention to these broader processes of legitimization.
I thought your Khmer Rouge example was incredibly powerful because what you articulated there is how easy it is for any of the values that we normally promote, to courage, duty, and so forth, to be given narrative around them and a context around them that makes them completely the engine for these large-scale crimes. Yes. Now that you see this banner that says duty and you think, uh-oh, what might that mean to someone? Would you like to jump in here, Matt? Or Mitt? Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that Jessica might say something about from the last chapter of the book where we talk about from the last chapter where we talk. I think this one's actually on about what the steps that we might take to address and prevent war crimes. I don't know if you wanted to say something about that.
How much time do you have? Well, in the book, as I said, we don't go into a lot of detail. This is more sort of suggestions that come out of our analysis, and I mentioned some of them very briefly. And again, it's more about sort of understanding that cause of moral legitimization, educating military personnel and officers about that, and providing a forum for dissenting narratives. Right? And that's quite confronting because often the narratives we're talking about are narratives that have been have an existence outside the military, that come from outside the military. So the narrative of, for example, the war against the Jews as a war to protect Germany from an existential threat, that narrative emerged from a very high level and then sort of filtered down and affected all the institutions that were involved in carrying it out. So, it's about challenging those narratives. That's very important. So, I mean, I'm very interested to hear suggestions for how that could be actually implemented, allowing dissenting narratives. How would that be implemented within the military, within military education? I think that's a really interesting question.
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, so one thing that occurred to me while we were working on this book is I became somewhat less hopeful about the prospect for the elimination of war crimes and this kind of inculcation of pernicious tendencies because of the degree to which this might come into conflict with the need for obedience in particular, but other qualities that need to be instantiated in military personnel to have an effective military unit. And I mean, I'm not committed to the claim that there is no hope, but
that tension, which we talked about this morning too, is there between obedience and dissent.
Yep.
And how do you cultivate both?
And I would also just say, I would also just say too that I do think one of the really crucial things is that there be punishment for war crimes.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, if a situation like the one you described and that nobody actually ends up being punished for rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl or not punished severely, that sends a very clear message about the leniency with which certain kinds of behaviour is treated. So, you can have as much military virtue education as you want, but if flagrant violations of military virtues and human rights and law are not treated as such, then I think there is going to be a fundamental problem in preventing such crimes, because that sends a message about the relative importance accorded to the victims of war crimes compared to the perpetrators.
And probably not just punishing. I mean, often we have this sense that the people who are most responsible and the people that ought to be sanctioned the most severely are the architects of these schemes, but that's often not the case, especially if the perpetrator on the ground has internalized a certain perspective. Then their action does call into question the moral standing of this victim, and that's to recognize, this is one of the things I was arguing, to recognize that moral fact about the relationship between victim and victimizer requires, we might think, the punishment of the victimizer, not just somebody higher up in the chain of command.
Or maybe both. Maybe there's enough punishment and blame to go around. Mitt, do you want to jump in here? And then we will open it to the floor if you're getting your questions ready.
Yeah, I think it's also important to appreciate that there is sort of ethical training, if you will, going on, even when it's not denominated as such. And indeed, it has to be going on apart from any sort of formal training that occurs. And I'm thinking, in particular, again, small unit level, in asymmetric warfare, there is a risk in operating in certain environments, such as Iraq or Afghanistan or perhaps others, that the local population at best is seen as an object of suspicion with for obvious reasons, given that combatants and civilians aren't easily distinguishable, and given that the civilians themselves may have sympathies toward insurgents, right? And that can mean that just day-to-day encounters with individuals can be, shall we say, not very rewarding. And, you know, I've heard people, you know, you've read, people think, you know, we come over here, we're trying to help, and these people are completely ungrateful, they're resentful, and in fact, they're probably behind our backs doing everything they can to sabotage us, right? And so what I've heard, you know, junior officers say is it's really important, right, to contribute to a narrative of what it is the unit is doing and why they're doing it that takes into account the position that these people are actually in, right? That they are caught often in circumstances over which they have very little control. They are living side by side with members of the Taliban or AQI or whoever, right? Some of whom may be relatives, family members, members of their tribe, or what have you. Someone's cousin may be a member of the Taliban who needs a place to stay. In other words, they are not in situations that we would normally think of, at least in the West, as sort of robust, autonomous settings in which they have complete freedom of action, right? And understanding that and why it is that they're wary of speaking to you know, an NCO who's trying to get information because they're concerned the Taliban is going to come and kill their family, for instance, right? Just trying to get them to appreciate a little more deeply that context can blunt, perhaps, some inclinations to be resentful that could eventually, you know, culminate in acts of violence on the view that, well, maybe these persons aren't technically combatants, but they're certainly not innocent civilians, right?
Yeah, and the dehumanization that goes along with this kind of thinking.
And that's ethics. That's ethics, even if, you know, the first lieutenant doesn't say the word ethics at all in that conversation.
It is ethics education. Let's hear from the floor. Please raise your hands high. First, way in the back. Yes, BJ. Hey.
Hey guys, good to see you. Congrats on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. So on the moral ignorance, right, as it does not give an excuse for moral responsibility, some of the stuff you touched on, Matt. I agree with you. I know that's controversial. I wonder if we can talk just for a minute about how that works. And I have a question for you about what we think is going on in that relationship between moral ignorance and then therefore not being an excuse for moral responsibility in these kind of cases. There's going to be some kind of problem there, some kind of failing, right? Some kind of epistemic duties in the moral realm that have been kind of failed to be met, at least in my view. You know, call it a failure of due diligence or something, but some sort of epistemic mistake, a moral epistemic mistake, that gives some kind of that results in moral ignorance, but we don't want to have that be an excuse. I wonder if what's happening here is actually not the moral ignorance that's doing the work for you, but the actual stakes involved, right? So some people call this like moral epistemic contextualism, right? Alexander Guerrero had that view, and a few others do as well. And the idea is simple, right? The thought is that whether or not your epistemic duties are met in a certain context depend upon the moral stakes involved. Very quick example. Let's say you're trying to determine a belief about the number of people in a building. If you're doing it for a census report, right, you can poke your head in, you can say, hey, hello, anybody in here? It doesn't look like there's anybody in here. I'm going to mark down 0, and maybe you have met your epistemic duties there, if that's the reason, if that's the stakes involved, just doing a census. But if you were going to maybe demolish that building with some, implode it, well, now you haven't met your epistemic duties, even though it was the exact same belief conclusion, right? In that case, you would think, we really better be sure no one's in here. Let's check every corner and nook and cranny before we explode it. The only thing that changed was not the epistemic standing, but the moral stakes involved. So the thought would be that maybe the reason we don't find moral ignorance morally excusing in these cases of war crimes isn't because of the actual thinking through of the moral understanding of the situation, but simply because the things that you're doing, right, in warfare and in these war crimes, the stakes are so incredibly high that ratchets up the epistemic duty. And maybe that's why we can say, yeah, maybe moral ignorance in some cases is excusing, and maybe ignorance can be a moral excuse in some cases, but because of the stakes involved in the context of war crimes, that the stakes themselves change the way we think the epistemic duties are met or not met. Something like that.
Well, I agree that. So, don't know, don't kill. That's the Guerrero? Yeah. Right. Yeah. I agree that the stakes are going to change epistemic duties, but I don't think that your present moral responsibility has to trace back. So philosophers who work on this will call this a tracing strategy. Right now, the drunk driver right now lacks capacity to avoid the school bus, but he's responsible because his lack of capacity traces back to an action that he made when he had the capacity, when he decided to take that first drink. And I don't think tracing is necessary. So I don't think I have to trace back to a violation of an epistemic duty. I agree that stakes change your epistemic duty, but I think that there could be a case where this person did everything that could have been expected of them to do. Epistemic, their epistemic hygiene is impeccable. We can't expect them to know any better because of the facts about how they were raised or forces that they've been exposed to. But it's still the case that their action has a moral significance that's sufficient to make blaming responses appropriate. So I agree in part, but I don't think that the kind of epistemic tracing is going to be necessary for blameworthiness. One thing we might say, so when we raise the stakes, one way that people think about this is that, well, look, that action was so obviously wrong. It's so easy to recognize that that's wrong, then you should have done it. And so that also changes. That's one way to think about how the stakes can change the duties, because when the stakes are high, it becomes more obvious that it's wrong. So it's easier to meet that, to meet your epistemic duty in that context. But of course, obviously wrong from our perspective, when we're thinking about people for whom it's not obviously wrong. And maybe everything in the cult, let's think about a slaveholding culture. It might be that everything in that person's culture speaks against the proposition that slaveholding is wrong. And so while it's obviously wrong to us, it might not be obvious to, we shouldn't be judging, the epistemic standard that we apply shouldn't be the one that we would apply to ourselves. It's got to be responding to the specific context in which the individual is. I agree with that, but I don't want to go the next step and say, well, now that I'm thinking about the context in which the slaveholder is existing, I realize that it was really difficult for her to come to appropriate moral understanding, therefore she's not blameworthy. I'm going to agree that it was difficult for her to come to that moral understanding, but moral understanding is not necessary for blameworthiness.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Don Scheid from Winona State over in Minnesota. This is a question for Talbert. As I understand it, you're suggesting in the Khmer Rouge case in those kind of situations where the troops have gotten lots of propaganda and inculcation, enculturation, that they then believe that it's permissible to rape or to torture. And they're still blameworthy on your account, if I'm understanding that, because the victims legitimately resent how they're being treated. Is that roughly the view? Now, it seems to me the problem that you haven't addressed then is, if I'm fighting the enemy and I believe that I'm on the right side and I'm doing the enemies, the bad guys, it's okay for me to kill them, but it's not okay for me to rape them or torture them. And you haven't made the distinction why it's okay, why I'm not blameworthy when I kill them, but I am blameworthy when I rape them or torture them.
I think I'm probably inclined to Jeff McMahon's perspective about this and just deny the moral equality of combatants. I mean, I don't think that if you're on the wrong side, morally speaking, and of course, the wrong side, that's a judgment that we're going to make from our own moral perspectives. But let's say there's an objective fact of the matter about who's on the right side and who's on the wrong side. It's not clear to me that if you're on the wrong side, then you're blameless for killing either. But I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, but if you wanted to.
Oh, well, I'm not quite sure that I understood, that I saw the force of the criticism. So it's wrong. I'm saying it's wrong for them. Yeah, so you were suggesting if I think it's wrong for them to rape, then I also ought to think that it's wrong for them to kill. And I'm inclined perhaps to accept that it is wrong for them to kill. That in fact, if you're on the wrong side, you're not excused.
I would also add to that, it's not the case that every act of violence communicates an objectionable disregard for the victims of violence, right? So it's not an implication of our view that every intentional act of harming is blameworthy. So if I kill someone in self-defense, right, I'm killing them, but it's not obviously true that the person I kill has standing to blame or resent me. Because, by intentionally attacking me, whatever your theory of self-defense is, so you might think, so if we think that killing in war is permissible, and there are lots of different accounts of why killing in war is permissible, which we don't need to get into, but if you accept a kind of standard view that killing in war is a kind of collective form of self-defense, and again, I'm not going to take a stand on that view now, but if that's what you accept, that allows you to distinguish killing in war from acts that are not about collective self-defense and for which the victims are not threats to you, such as the use of rape and torture or killing of civilians. So that could be one way of distinguishing it, that if I'm killing in self-defense, I'm committing an act of violence, but it's not clear that I'm wrongfully disregarding your moral standing when I do that. So if killing in war is a form of self-defense, that would be one way of distinguishing the moral significance of killing to the person who's killed versus the objectionable attitudes expressed through actions like rape and torture and killing of civilians. So I think that's one possible way of making that distinction. I mean, or you could say, yeah, if you think that you're fighting on an unjust side, then yeah, you are killing people who are not. I don't mean entitled to be killed. What do I mean? Liable to be killed. That's what I mean. Yeah, and then so that does, in effect, your participation in an unjust war does, in effect, show a kind of commitment to objectionable moral attitude. So yeah, you could take that view as well if you think that if you take a kind of McMahon type view. But yeah, that's what I want to say.
We might say, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this, but we could, I think, easily say that, look, combatants have given up their claim to not be targeted, that they're legitimate targets. And so, as Jess was pointing out, killing them isn't violating, isn't calling into question their moral standing, isn't violating some right that they have because insofar as they're in this arena, they've given up their claim to not be targeted, but that doesn't apply to non-combatants. So it does seem like we could distinguish the treatment of the non-combatant from the treatment of the combatant, even on the side of the unjust fighter.
In the interest of time, too, I wanted to take a few more questions, but you guys can continue this debate as we go on. But I see hands in the back and in the front. First, right here. Yes. Yeah. Microphone's coming behind you. Sorry, it's hard to hear.
I was wondering if you could clarify. So you had talked about situationalism, and you said that you didn't necessarily endorse it for your view of war crimes. And when Professor Regan was speaking, he talked about small group dynamics and how that can influence some war crimes in terms of, say, the Mahmoudiya massacre described in Black Hearts. So I was just wondering if you can explain, do you think that there's multiple levels of like different forms of war crimes that are influenced by levels? So are some at the individual level, small group level, high societal level that's top down? I was just wondering if you can clarify your position.
I mean, the distinction I did want to make was between war crimes that occur through a process of legitimization where they're not viewed as crimes at all by people who perpetrate them, versus war crimes which are understood to be crimes. But again, and both sorts might come out of the kind of processes I've talked about. So I think, Mitt is absolutely right that, when we're looking at understanding an individual's behaviour, right, why did this person do this action? It's not just necessarily we've got to point to different levels, but what we're seeing and the sort of social psychology approach that we draw on suggests that, well, we have to understand, how did the individual interpret the situation in which they acted? What did it mean to them? So it may be that at a small group level, due to the various forces that Mitt discussed, members of that small group might interpret loyalty to have a very particular meaning, and that's going to then influence their actions. And that will also bring to the table their pre-existing beliefs and goals and self-conceptions. And so understanding war crimes at that level also does require the same kind of interaction between these available frameworks and the individual's own interpretation of them. So, why was it, first of all, why was it seen to okay to do this act? And then why, for example, was it covered up? So I guess that's how I think our framework can provide mechanisms for understanding war crimes, many different kinds of war crimes. And the basic social psychological framework that we adopt would say, like in the case that Mitt talks about and also cases that I talk about, we still see this same dynamic interplay between the person and the situation. That, Karl Kretschmer interprets a situation of killing Jewish civilians to be a situation of national self-defense, protection against an existential threat. And for him, that influences both his emotional responses to what he's doing, his engagement with what he's doing, and the way he rationalises and justifies it and makes sense of it within his own self-image as a good person. And so that kind of process, I think, would occur in relation to all kinds of war crimes, not just legitimised ones and not just ones which are what we might call sort of heat of battle war crimes. So I don't know if that helps clarify what I mean. But yeah, basically I would say in any kind of war crime, you want to ask about, what was it, how did the individual interpret what was going on? And how was that interpretation shaped by available sort of broader forces to which they were exposed? And it's an dynamic interplay.
Mitt would like to jump in.
Oh, sure.
Just to say one example of this, the incident in Haditha, which ended up with 24 civilians killed. There were obviously small unit influences in play there. The investigative report also suggested, at least, that in the Iraqi theater in general, there was sort of less weight that tended to be attached to civilian casualties. They were sort of seen, I think, the terms that the report used were they were sort of a cost of doing business, right? So you get that. That's at least implicitly perhaps conveyed in various ways on one level. Now that's going to be refracted and filtered through, and there could well be various units that either going to resist that or, just it's going to be articulated in different sorts of ways, right? And so it's not deterministic, right? That it's going to there's going to be successive processes of articulation and translation, right? So I think that, but I would say, the higher the level at which there's an articulation that legitimizes sort of wrongful behavior, the greater the risk, right? That that you're going to be facing. It's not going to be.
Some very interesting individual interpretations of these high-level narratives. So in Alexander Hinton's book on the Khmer Rouge, he talks about some people who started to engage in cannibalism, right, as part of when they were involved in executions. And that wasn't part of the Khmer Rouge's plan, it wasn't in the training manuals. It was something that, for whatever reason, had significance to them as individuals. So you do get, even when there is this sort of, Mitt's right, when there's a high-level dangerous or objectionable social articulation of morality that's legitimizing war crimes, that's when it's much more likely that these things will occur and people will see them as permissible. But then you still get these kind of ways in which individuals then interpret and shape them and bring their own values or goals and beliefs to the table in ways that make a difference to behaviour on the ground too.
We started just a tiny bit late, so I'm going to squeeze in one last question from the back table there.
Hi, John Huntsman. May I have a response to Dr. Scheid's question? So
The second follow-up?
yeah, so as a follow-up, so I think maybe, and certainly we haven't met, but I'm a student at Naval Postgraduate School. Mm-hmm. As far as a possible move, as far as answering that question is what makes the distinction between killing, torturing, and rape. I think what was brought up in the discussion was the lack of regard. Mm-hmm. And so to kill somebody in combat, you don't have to have a lack of regard of their moral standing. Mm-hmm. You could have complete respect for the object. Whereas, for torture or rape, I think it's kind of, there's a presumed part of the impaired normative competence is that they don't properly regard, that object in the right way. So no, maybe not. So
and there's
anyway,
a dehumanization that's occurred.
Yeah. So if you're gonna torture somebody. Yeah, I fully, but if I kill somebody, I can still respect you, as I'm doing it, in a way, if that makes sense.
One thing I might say too is that, we're making certain assumptions that we feel are relatively uncontroversial. I'm starting with the assumption that rape is wrong. And look, I could come up with some hypothetical scenario in which rape perhaps is permissible because I'm a philosopher and philosophers are very good at coming up with crazy hypothetical scenarios. I don't see any value in doing that, and I don't think doing that would challenge the justifiable claim that rape is a gross violation of the victim's moral standing. So if we want to disagree about whether rape is wrong, that's sort of a debate I'm really, in some sense, not that interested in engaging in, because I feel like that's something I'm willing to take for granted. I'm willing to bring that to the table and say, yeah, I'm going to commit to the view that rape is wrong. Even if I could imagine some crazy scenario in which it perhaps is permissible. Now, I think what's maybe going on with this question is that some people think that torture is justified in some cases. Now, if torture is genuinely justified, then justification provides an excuse, right? If you're performing an act of violence that is justified, then that doesn't necessarily show the objectionable attitudes that we talk about as relevant to blameworthiness. There I would say I don't really want to get into debate about when and if torture is justified. I'm willing to grant that, again, in a hypothetical scenario involving ticking bombs, maybe. The cases we're talking about in the book are not cases of justified torture under any plausible theory of justified torture. So the cases we're looking at are cases where we can draw a distinction between here's an act which does not meet any plausible theory of justification, even if it is possible that such an act could, in some other cases, meet that standard, and distinguishing, and so in those circumstances, torture does display this very objectionable disregard for the victim's welfare that we talk about, and will ground blameworthiness. Now, maybe there might be, killing might also be unjustified as well in that case, but the question then is, well, depending on what your theory of justified killing in war is, that will make a difference to your answer in that case as well.
And with that, I think, I thought you two were lined up there, so I had meant to indicate the two back table questions. If you could keep it brief, though, thank you.
Yeah, Scott Orr, Special Forces. So my question really is about agency. I think one of the problems if I understand the argument correctly here, is that we're saying that agency at the individual soldier or operator or sailor level kind of doesn't matter. So that leads me maybe to have to, if I'm going to agree with you, bite the bullet and say that it's the leadership. And then we talked about small units. So if that's the case and we accept all of these arguments, if I understand you correctly, should we be perhaps concentrating more senior leadership at a more tactical level, particularly during irregular operations, because although you use sort of like a major combat operation Holocaust example, I actually believe that most of your implications that you've articulated are really for counterterrorism type operations or security force assistance in the irregular spectrum, not necessarily the conventional one. So that's my question. Can you just clean up the agency thing for me? Thank you.
Solve the problem of agency. I actually think that our account gives much more significance to the agency of military personnel than, for example, the situationist account. So the situationist account paints military personnel as kind of pushed around by external situational forces, even to the extent that their beliefs are the product of external forces. Whereas our account says no, understanding individual behaviour at whatever level is about understanding how the agency of the individual shapes their interpretation of the situation and shapes their behaviour and interacts. So actually, I think our view gives military personnel greater agency than perhaps, at least in relation, I'm talking here more about understanding the causes of war crimes. And so I think, understanding the fact that, individual military personnel at all levels reflect on and think about and are actively engaged in making sense of what they do, which is what the sort of Felix Landau and Karl Kretschmer examples, I think, illustrate quite nicely. That does, I think, then have implications for thinking about, well, when we do talk about how we should, strategies we could use at the small group level, at the high level, we are accepting that military personnel are active agents who are I think as Alexander Hinton calls, active meaning makers, right? And so acknowledging that actually does then give them more agency and perhaps offers more scope for them thinking about prevention at that level as well. That said, in terms of the leaders, I do think in general has been a tendency to not attribute sufficient responsibility sometimes to leadership in relation to war crimes, at least in relation to legal punishment. Often it's been the case that people who are more lower ranked seems to be more likely to be subject to legal punishment than people who are in higher rank. So I think also understanding the participation of leadership in creating and enforcing or replicating certain kinds of dangerous narratives is something that I think is important to do.
And I would just suggest that if you want to explore this notion of agency further in more detail, this notion that they mentioned of the cognitive affective personality system that Walter Michaels and others have developed provides a good account that reconciles much of the situationist literature with the notion that there are sort of stable character traits, even though they're dynamic and there's a constant process of negotiation of the individual and situational forces. Nonetheless, there is a kind of a structure that characterizes what we can think of as character and therefore agency. So that CAPS approach, as it's called, I think is a really valuable way if agency is something you're particularly interested in exploring.
And with that, can we thank our panel one more time?